Smoke fills a passenger plane 10 kilometers in the sky.
We're on Mayday. We're going down.
Electrical systems shut down as the smoke spreads. The crew tries desperately to land their stricken plane.
We're gonna need an emergency landing. Put your hat on our lap.
We're going to need 5 trucks. They're standing by for you.
What seemed like a small problem at first has become a life-or-death struggle for everyone on board Air Canada Flight 797. Early evening, June the 2nd, 1983. Supper time aboard Air Canada Flight 797. Captain Donald Cameron has been working for Air Canada for 17 years and has flown almost 5,000 hours on a DC-9. But it doesn't mean he gets to eat first.
How's your seafood? Nice?
Before he can dig in, his first officer, Claude Ouimet, will have to finish.
Good.
The jet is in the middle of a flight from Dallas, Texas to Montreal with a stopover in Toronto. The heavy cloud cover below hides some light showers, but at their cruising altitude of 10,000 meters, the view is clear and bright. The DC-9 is only half full today, with 41 passengers scattered throughout the plane.
Can I have some tea, please?
24-year-old Diane Fadley is an active member of the Juvenile Diabetes Foundation.
We have a number of different fundraising activities, and once a year they have a large conference, and at this time it happened to be in Toronto.
Raymond Chalifaux is 23 and recently married. An engineer, he's returning home from his first ever business trip.
It was a little bit frightening both for me and for my wife. I was supposed to be gone 4 or 5 days, so first time we were separated for a long period of time, so it was kind of insecure for me, yeah.
And a few rows further up sits a growing legend in the world of folk music. Stan Rogers is just 33, but his career is beginning to take off outside of his native Canada.
I think Stan's best-known songs celebrate ordinary people. The songs are really about ordinary people rising to the occasion and becoming heroes on their own.
Just before 7 o'clock, the plane is a little more than halfway to Toronto.
What was that? It's right there, I see it. Right there.
Yeah.
3 circuit breakers have popped out. Like fuses, they protect delicate electrical circuits on the plane from becoming overloaded.
Like a machine gun.
Yeah. Zap, zap, zap.
The 3 breakers are for the flushing motor in the toilet at the rear of the plane. Cameron decides to give them a few minutes before he tries to reset them again.
You know, sometimes it overworks and overeats, and then the breaker popped, and then it cools off, and then you push the breaker and everything is fine. So put the snag in the logbook, and that's it.
Someone must have pushed a rag down the toilet or something. Jammed it and it overheated.
Cameron thinks that something must be stopping the motor from working properly. But it's not an emergency. Toilets get blocked all the time. Several minutes pass as the plane continues on its way to Toronto. Flight attendants Laura Kayama and Judy Davidson are busy serving up dinner in the cabin. In the cockpit, it's Captain Cameron's turn for dinner. But first, he wants to reset the 3 circuit breakers. Without them, the toilet won't work. The rest of the flight could get uncomfortable for the passengers.
Pop says I push it.
He's given it more than 8 minutes. But whatever is wrong with the washroom, it isn't fixing itself. In the cabin, one of the passengers complains about a disturbing odor.
Yeah, that is a strange smell. Let me take a look.
Connie Kirsch, a Texan headed for a business meeting in Toronto, is seated at the back of the plane.
I had smelled a peculiar smell where I was sitting. And it struck me as odd. Actually, it was a wiry smell. It wasn't a smoke smell.
A wisp of smoke is leaking out of the washroom. The smoke and the acrid smell of burning plastic takes Davidson by surprise. This is much more than just a clogged toilet. Other passengers are beginning to notice the smoke and the suffocating smell.
Sergio, there's a problem in the washer. Judy says there's a fire.
Okay, I'll be right there.
Chief Flight Attendant Sergio Benetti is in charge of the cabin crew.
As a precaution, we're moving everyone a few rows up.
The smoke is noxious and overpowering. Benetti can't see any flames. He sprays the fire extinguisher into the tiny washroom, trying to coat every surface.
As soon as I saw that fire extinguisher, something went through my mind. There is definitely something wrong. The guy seemed to have the thing under control, so he's gonna do his job and things will be business as usual.
It's 2 minutes past 7, just 11 minutes since the circuit breakers first popped out. Laura Kayama brings Captain Cameron the disturbing news.
Excuse me, Captain. There's a fire in the washroom in the back. They just went back to go put it out.
You want me to go back?
Yeah, go.
A fire on board an aircraft is one of the worst situations any crew can face. The plane is some 10 kilometers high. What starts as a spark can turn deadly in a few short minutes. But at the moment, Cameron doesn't know how bad the situation is.
You got to remember, in 1983, people were allowed to smoke in the aircraft. And there had been a number of incidents of this sort of in the industry. So it really didn't alarm me that much.
Ouimet finds the situation is worse than he expected.
I didn't see any flames when I opened the door before, but I sprayed it really good with the fire extinguisher.
You think it was a cigarette in the garbage?
No, not really.
Okay. Can't get back there. Smoke's too heavy. I think we'd better go down.
But Flight Attendant Sergio Benetti has a very different assessment of the situation.
You don't have to worry. I think the smoke's easing up.
It's a confusing moment for Captain Cameron.
Some components do fail from time to time that are not severe or serious enough to cause an emergency descent. That's a pretty serious thing.
When Ouimet and Benetti were at the back of the plane, the smoke seemed thick, but now it appears to be subsiding.
Okay, it's starting to clear now. But I'll go back and check if that's okay.
Yeah, that's okay. Take these goggles. I'll leave my mask on. Go back wherever you can, but don't get yourself incapacitated.
No problem. No problem.
If it's just a broken toilet motor, Cameron can still make it to Toronto. But if it's more serious, he'll have to land immediately before the small inconvenience becomes a deadly problem. June the 2nd, 1983. Air Canada Flight 797 cruises through the early evening. The flight has taken an unsettling turn. Wisps of smoke are gathering at the back of the DC-9. An acrid smell is spreading through the cabin. The crew is growing concerned. They've already moved passengers towards the front of the jet, as far as possible from the creeping smoke. Captain Donald Cameron is waiting for an update from the back of the plane, when suddenly he's got a new problem. The master warning light is on. Electrical systems throughout the plane, including some in the cockpit, begin to fail.
The airplane basically lost all its sophisticated navigation and attitude information. So I was left very suddenly with, I think, 3 engine instruments per engine and 4 flight instruments, which were very primitive. They were what you might have flown a World War II bomber with.
With his electrical systems starting to shut down, Cameron calls the nearest ground control.
Memphis Center, this is Air Canada 797.
Air Canada 797, Indianapolis Center. Go ahead.
Yeah, we've got an electrical problem here. We may be off communication shortly. Stand by.
Co-pilot Claude Ouimet is at the back of the plane. The washroom door handle has become hot to the touch. He doesn't even risk opening it. Faced with a potential fire on board, the crew have no choice but to land their plane as soon as possible.
I don't like what's happening. I think we'd better go down. We're going to be making an emergency descent. Brief the cabin crew. Yes, sir.
As soon as the decision is made, another warning light goes on. They've just lost most of their emergency power.
We're talking about multiple failure here, and it's starting to be complicated. So we're going down, and obviously we have to land.
Mayday, mayday, mayday.
A small problem has snowballed into an all-out emergency.
Mayday, mayday, mayday.
This is Louisville Control, over.
Air Canada 797, we have a fire on board. We are going down.
Can you possibly make Cincinnati?
Roger that.
Cincinnati is 46 kilometers away. They can make it. Captain Cameron begins an initial descent to 1,500 meters. The crew has switched to emergency battery power, but many of the plane's instruments aren't functioning.
So all we had left was DC immer power, and that's only good for radios, basically.
It's not only instruments. Cameron finds that a critical piece of his plane isn't working properly. The horizontal stabilizer on the tail of his DC-9 is frozen. Cameron uses the part that's still working, the elevators, to make the plane dive. But like a car that's lost power steering, the aircraft resists. As Cameron pushes on the controls, they push back with a pressure equal to 20 kilograms.
The airplane became very heavy, and I took my total concentration to fly the airplane.
An acrid, bitter smoke is creeping forward from the back of the plane and seeping in from the seams in the fuselage ceiling. It hovers like a cloud over the passengers' heads.
Incredibly harsh smoke that was really irritating your throat. You had to take really, really small breath, otherwise you would choke.
I could see it rise. It was traveling along those luggage racks, you know, coming forward.
The smell of burning plastic fills the air. Dropping oxygen masks could make the situation worse.
I could have deployed the oxygen mask for the passengers, but it's forbidden. You're only allowed to use the oxygen mask in the case of a massive decompression or loss of cabin pressure, not for fire.
I was crying and scared. I wasn't hysterical. The gentleman sitting next to me explained to me that if I would not cry and if I could, you know, conserve my, not breathe so fast, that it would conserve the oxygen, would help us, and not to worry, that the flight attendants, they really know how to handle these sort of situations.
As the electrical malfunctions ripple through the plane, the PA system shuts down. Flight attendants struggle to shout directions, but it's getting more and more difficult to breathe. In 1983, it's not standard procedure to tell passengers how to open the emergency doors. But in this case, The two flight attendants are taking no chances.
As plain as possible.
As smoke begins entering the cockpit, the captain's situation is becoming critical. For the first time, we met talks to the Cincinnati airport.
Approach, Air Canada 797. We're on Mayday. We're going down.
Air Canada 797, Cincinnati approach. Planned runway 36 ILS. And the equipment has been alerted. Do you have time to give me the nature of the emergency?
We have a fire in the washroom. We're filling up with smoke right now.
Say, type of aircraft, number of people on board, and amount of fuel.
We'll copy that later. We don't have time.
Gregory Karam is the approach tower controller. He's the lifeline for the struggling jet. He can't see the plane on radar yet, but he knows it's in trouble.
There was really no mayhem whatsoever, no screaming, nothing at all. In fact, it was very quiet and calm. And again, I was terrified at that point.
Almost 13 minutes after 7, Karam catches sight of Flight 797 on his radar.
Air Canada 797, you are now fully identified. This will be a no-gyro radar approach for runway 27 left. Descend now to 3,500 feet. Your position is now 12 miles southeast of the airport.
The crew needs to be guided in from the ground. Struggling to see through the dense smoke, they could easily veer off course. Karam will talk them down, watching them every step of the way. In the cabin, the smoke and heat are becoming unbearable.
My thought was, well, we're gonna crash. They won't be able to identify myself because I didn't have my papers with me, so I stood up, I took my wallet in the compartment and put my jacket on so that they could identify my body.
I knew at that point, that's when I decided or felt that I was not going to make it because I felt I would never see my family again, and the situation just seemed very impossible.
Stan, he certainly had a sense of his own mortality, and he hated to fly. But the demand for Stan was growing, so he was flying more often. And he certainly had a sense that with so much traveling, his risk is elevated.
Where's the airport?
12 o'clock and 8 miles, Air Canada.
Okay, we're trying to locate it. We're going to need fire trucks.
They're standing by for you. Can you give me the number of people and amount of fuel?
We don't have time. Getting worse in here.
Understood, sir. Turn left now. You are 1/2 mile north of final approach.
Finally, the crew see the airport.
Okay, we have the airport.
The tower has you in sight. You need not acknowledge further transmission from the Air Canada 797. You are cleared to land. You are 4 miles from the airport. Good luck.
In a thick haze of smoke and soot, flight attendants Laura Kayama and Judy Davidson feel their way along the aisle, trying to reassure the passengers. They can't get past the 12th row. The smoke and the heat are overwhelming.
I was praying the whole time. Dear God, please help us land this plane. Please get this plane safely on the ground. Can't see, can't breathe, death absolutely crossed my mind, but hang in there, don't give up.
I've been married for less than a year and it's already over. So I started breathing as little as I could and start thinking seriously at my wife.
Fighting the reluctant controls, Captain Cameron's strength is being pushed to the limit.
"797, the tower has you in sight."
Squinting through the smoke, the crew of Flight 797 land hard. At 20 minutes after 7, the Air Canada plane is on the ground. It's less than 30 minutes since the first sign of any trouble on board Flight 797.
When we touch the ground, I assume that we're safe now. Now let's get out of this airplane.
But inside the plane, the smoke isn't letting up. Passengers are undoing their seatbelts and trying desperately to escape.
I got up out of my seat, and I remember putting my hands up on someone's back, and it was like waiting in a line. And I knew that was one line I didn't want to wait very long. So I turned around and went the other direction, not knowing I was actually heading towards the front of the plane.
Sergio Bonetti is the first one to the door. He helps gasping passengers escape. The cabin is pitch black and burning hot. In the cockpit, the crew quickly shuts the plane down. The first officer escapes through the emergency window. It's a 5-meter jump to the ground. Passengers have opened 3 of the overwing exits. But even with the doors open, the exits are all but invisible. The smoke is too thick.
I saw a light, and it was the door that had opened. Someone had opened the door. I realized what it was. I ran to the door and held my help. I just put my face out so I could breathe.
Passengers who have found the exits slide off the wing and stumble to safety. On the ground, Laura Kayama and Judy Davidson frantically move passengers away from the deadly plane. Fire rescue vehicles surround the plane. They douse the plane's exterior and the ground beneath with foam, fearing a fuel fire or worse, an explosion. Through the cockpit window, we can see Captain Cameron sitting in his seat looking dazed and slumped towards the wheel.
First thing that got my attention was to see Don's face in the window and realize that he was not completely conscious.
I couldn't get out of my seat. I'd start and I'd get my arse up in the air or like that, and I'd be pushed back by I have no idea, it was an invisible force, but it was probably smoke and fire.
Desperately trying to save the captain's life, tells firefighters to cover him with foam.
It was this soapy, ice-cold mixture that drenched me.
It works. Cameron stirs and climbs out through the cockpit window.
Stop! There he is! Stop!
Barely 90 seconds have passed since the plane landed, when suddenly the whole interior of Flight 797 ignites. The flames roll through the cabin like a train. Captain Donald Cameron is the last person to get out of the plane alive.
We knew there were people in the airplane, unfortunately, at that point. That was finished.
The cabin fire breaks through the top of the fuselage. Black smoke can be seen for kilometers. Flight attendant Laura Kayama begins to count.
I will remember these words forever. She told us to line up so that she could count the survivors. If there were survivors, obviously they were dead.
Including the crew, there had been 46 people aboard the plane. But there aren't 46 people on the runway.
I really thought that if the pilot could land the plane, we would all get off. But I knew when I looked around, I didn't think we were all there.
The passengers who escaped the plane suffer from smoke inhalation and minor injuries, but most are not badly hurt.
It was almost like if you got off the plane, nothing was wrong. I mean, there was maybe a sprained ankle, maybe someone had a broken arm or something. You made it and you were completely fine, or you didn't make it.
The young man next to me that helped me with my breathing techniques didn't survive. That was a real tough blow, because I know, for one, I believe he played a big part in my survival.
I guess it was around midnight. I decided to call Air Canada. I said, I'm trying to find out if a friend of mine was on this flight in Cincinnati. And she said, are you a member of the family? I said, no, I'm just a close friend. And she said, do you know if his wife is alone? And I said, well, yes. And she said, well, she may need somebody with her.
Stan Rogers, the rising musical star, didn't make it off the plane.
Cincinnati ground. This is captain of the Air Canada flight that's on fire here.
Captain Cameron radios Cincinnati ground control from an emergency vehicle near his plane. He has a sobering message.
It seems there are 23 people left on board the aircraft. Is there a scheduled carrier runs into here that could maybe give aid and shelter to our stranded passengers? It's pretty cold out here.
What began with a simple electrical problem has taken the lives of 23 people. What caused the deadly fire? What went so horribly wrong? The investigation will uncover the plane's troubling history. This DC-9 had another serious accident just a few years before. In June of 1983, a strange smell in the back of an Air Canada DC-9 quickly turned into an all-out emergency. For 15 minutes, passengers and crew struggled to deal with thick, toxic smoke as it rolled through the plane. Flight 797 made a remarkable landing, only to burst into flames 90 seconds later. "23 people didn't escape the plane. Now the burnt shell of the DC-9 sits on the runway at the Greater Cincinnati Airport. It's one of the most disturbing airplane disasters in years. Within the hour, investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board are on the scene. The first grim task of the investigators is to recover the bodies of the dead. 21 Canadians and 2 Americans. Many are burned beyond recognition. Almost all of the victims are found in the front half of the plane, between the wings and the cockpit. Some are still strapped into their seats. Others are found in the aisles. And even though all the passengers had been moved up earlier in the flight, 2 bodies are found near the rear, beyond the wings.
Because of the dense smoke in the cabin, the passengers couldn't see well enough to find the exits. And 2 passengers went beyond the overwing exits and succumbed to the environment.
Investigators take blood samples from the bodies. They find deadly levels of certain chemicals that were produced as the plane burned.
When we did toxicological studies, we were able to determine that there were some significant high levels of cyanide and fluoride in the blood, as well as carbon monoxide.
It's not known if the toxic fumes killed the passengers. All that's certain is that they were unable to escape before the flames tore through.
When I went on board, I was just struck by the acrid smell. It was kind of eerie because there was a lot of fire damage. A lot of the fuselage was burned. You know, the interior of the cabin was burned down to the tops of the seats.
With the bodies removed, investigators begin digging through the wreckage to try and find the cause of the fire. Among them are members of the FBI.
They were investigating to determine whether terrorism might have been a factor, so they were on scene right away looking at the aircraft to make that determination.
The FBI examines pieces of the plane's floor, samples of water from the washroom, even a plastic vial found on the floor.
The FBI became involved very early because of the possibility of a crime taking place takes precedent over a accident. They were looking for anything that would have to do with an incendiary device or a small explosive device or anything that could be fused to start a fire. They determined that there was no evidence of any crime being committed. It was probably accidental ignition, and so they then left and NTSB took over the accident.
Having discounted the possibility that the fire was deliberately set, investigators consider the next obvious cause: a cigarette. When smoking on planes was still allowed, the most common source of fires in a washroom was the trash container. Investigators examine the trash container and find that the top is burned away, but the trash chute and the container behind and below the sink are intact. Inside the container are remnants of paper, scorched but not burned. The fire could not have started here. With the most obvious potential causes discounted, investigators begin to comb through the wreckage looking for what had started the fire. Studying the history of the plane, Hill uncovers some startling facts. In the year before the accident, 76 separate maintenance issues had been written up in the plane's logbook. All were dealt with, but still, it's an unusually high number of problems. The plane's troubled history didn't end there. 4 years earlier, the rear bulkhead had failed, causing an explosive decompression. The crew had to make an emergency landing.
It knocked out a lot of electrical cable and hydraulics and stuff like that, and the guy did a hell of a job bringing it back to Boston.
The plane was repaired and put back into service, but Hill focuses on the wires that had to be stitched together after the accident. A bad repair job could have been the cause of the fire.
There were wires that ran through there that had been cut, spliced back together.
Investigators study all the wire splices they can find on Flight 797 that weren't destroyed in the fire, but they find no evidence of arcing or short-circuiting. It's another dead end. Investigators turn their attention to the cockpit voice recorder and the popping circuit breakers.
What was that? It's right there, I see it.
Right there.
Yeah.
Like a machine gun. Yeah. Zap, zap, zap.
The circuit breakers trip as a precaution. When they begin to overheat, the circuit breakers turn off, cutting electrical current to the motor. It's a safety feature, so the motor won't cause a fire.
Pops as I push it.
Investigators need to know if the breakers were tripped by a fire that had already started, or was the motor itself the problem? The NTSB build a mock-up of the plane's washroom and force the flush motor to seize. They want to see if it could have started the fire. The seized motor reaches a temperature of 428 degrees Celsius. It's hot, but it's not hot enough to ignite parts of the washroom around the motor. As they listen to the cockpit voice recorder, investigators uncover a puzzling clue. 3 minutes before the circuit breakers popped, the recorder picked up another noise. It was the sound of electrical arcing, like static, repeated 8 times. The noises weren't audible to the crew. Hidden from view on any airplane is a river of wiring. Investigators focus on a cable coming from a generator below the washroom floor. Insulation had rubbed off 2 wires, making it possible for sparks to be produced, sparks that could start a fire.
There was evidence that there was some electrical arcing, but it could have occurred after the insulation had burned on those wires.
In spite of countless hours of investigation and numerous tests, in the end, the NTSB can't pinpoint the exact cause of the fire. There simply isn't enough evidence.
Just because of the vast amount of damage that was done in that concentrated area around the lavatory where the fire burnt for a long period of time and possibly destroyed any of the evidence of where the fire actually ignited.
Even if they'll never know the exact cause of the fire, investigators try to understand how it could cause so much damage. There had been heat and smoke, but no one had seen any flames until an explosion ripped through the jet.
When you have a fire that has incomplete combustion, when it has a lack of oxygen, they will produce combustible gases. Those gases then can collect, especially in the crown of an aircraft.
The fire had burned out of sight behind the washroom walls, and the smoke, hot gases and fumes intensified and spread inside the wall space from the washroom through to the cabin walls. Those spaces acted as a sort of chimney for the gases and smoke that the fire was creating. Although the fire remained concealed behind the walls and ceiling panels, the smoke and hot gases entered the cabin through every seam, gathering in the upper space in the cabin and pressing down on the passengers.
The inaccessible areas and the cabin area are all linked together through small cracks and crevices and small openings. The plane is one big pressure vessel with everything being the same, equilibrated to the same pressure. So smoke and gases in those areas would fairly quickly start to permeate into the passenger cabin.
When the doors were opened during the evacuation, an unlimited supply of oxygen was suddenly available to feed the fire. The more intense the heat, the more oxygen hungry a fire becomes. The gas is ignited with the force of an explosion.
Once you have a flashover, you produce heat, toxic gases, and you burn up all the oxygen in the cabin, and it becomes non-survivable.
The technical part of the investigation is complete. But there are still a lot of questions about how the crew responded to the fire.
The first officer says it's starting to clear now, and at that point I reckon that the fire was under control.
Could they have done more to prevent the tragedy on board Flight 797? In 1983, a washroom fire on an Air Canada DC-9 filled the plane's cabin with smoke. The crew struggled to land the plane, but a flash fire ripped through the jet moments after it came to a stop. 23 people were killed.
There was a fireman hollering at us. I think the quote was, "She could blow at any minute."
NTSB investigators are unable to definitively pinpoint the cause of the fire. But after reviewing all the information they have, they're ready to release their report. The report on the lethal fire aboard Air Canada Flight 797 is published a year after the accident. It's a landmark in aircraft safety, but it immediately makes for controversial headlines. The NTSB points out that the source of the smoke was never identified, either by the flight attendants or the first officer. The captain was never told, nor did he inquire as to the precise location and extent of the fire which had been reported to him.
And with that in mind, what type of fire did you believe that you had?
The bin fire.
Mayday, Mayday, Mayday.
And the report asks a hypothetical question.
Canada 797, we have a fire on board. We are going down.
Can you possibly make Cincinnati?
Roger that.
If he'd begun to descend sooner, could the captain have landed at Standiford Field Airport in Louisville, Kentucky? It was a few minutes closer. The report and the media attention it gets are devastating to Captain Cameron and his crew. Soon after the report is released, there's an outcry among pilots in the industry. They resent its implied criticism of Flight 797's crew and the suggestion that they could have begun their descent 5 minutes sooner. Several months later, the Airline Pilots Association submits a petition that defends Cameron and the crew. It makes an impact. The NTSB release a revised report, including the petition by the Airline Pilots Association. In the petition, First Officer We Met writes an impassioned defense of landing the plane where and when they did. The issue wasn't only the distance to the nearest airport, but the required rate of descent. As it was, the plane barely made the descent to the greater Cincinnati airport. Still, the National Transportation Safety Board's revised summary doesn't pull all its punches, pointing a finger at Captain Cameron. The report states that the time taken to evaluate the nature of the fire and to decide to initiate an emergency descent contributed to the severity of the accident. 20 years later, the statement still stings.
I'm glad they were all, the people that got off. I'm very sorry that the people that didn't get off because we spent a lot of time and effort getting them there. That really bothered me. All I know is that I did the best I could.
Along with the comments on the performance of the crew, the NTSB recommends a host of safety improvements. Perhaps if the flight had been full, someone would have noticed the smell of smoke sooner. But what the washroom of Flight 797 could have used was a smoke detector. They weren't standard throughout the industry, but after Flight 797, attitudes and regulations changed. Even though flight attendants did receive some training in dealing with fires aboard a plane, it didn't go far enough. But what was more obvious, the flight attendants weren't properly equipped to attack fires. Without full-face masks and oxygen, they couldn't be expected to fight fire while holding their breath. In the years after Flight 797, attendants received better equipment and training. The cabin crew had also made split-second decisions that helped save lives. Moving passengers further up the plane and handing out wet towels minimized the effects of the toxic smoke. Their decision to tell passengers to open the emergency exits over the wings was not standard procedure, but it let some passengers escape more quickly and was eventually adopted as a routine practice. Finally, it became obvious from the location of some of the bodies that passengers died because of precious seconds lost trying to find the exits in the pitch dark. What would have made a difference? Track lighting on the floors and bumps along the overhead bins that identified the rows with emergency exits. Features that would eventually become standard.
As a direct result of 797, a number of rules were changed, including a more stringent test for seats, a heat release and smoke requirement for cabin interior panels, requirement for smoke detectors in lavatories, and halon fire extinguishers in the cabin.
Emergency landing. Put your head on your lap. Stay in that.
But the changes were too late for those who died on Flight 797, like the man sitting beside Connie Kirsch. Months after the crash, his wife tracked Connie down.
She said, I just understand my husband was the one that was next to you, and I just wanted to know how was he? What was his spirits? And I said, he was in great spirits. He's very nice. He let me sit next to him and explained to me how to breathe. That was really difficult, you know, and the guilt that I carried for a long time was difficult. But I'm past the guilt, but I guess when you go back to it and you think about it like this in detail, you're right back there.
Stan Rogers was another victim of Flight 797. He would never be able to fulfill the promise of his life and growing career.
I loved his generosity and his loyalty as a friend. As an artist, he was perhaps one of the best songwriters this country's ever produced, and it was really an incredible pleasure and honor to be working with him. He still gets lots and lots of airplay, and so his legend grows.
Sometime after the accident, 2 Air Canada employees show up at Diane Fatley's door in Dallas.
They brought my Bible. It's dark because it was burned and singed, but it's a paperback Bible, and it did not completely burn up. This is just a reminder to me that God was with me. And I believe He protected me. And, you know, He was there with me.
Captain Cameron and his crew eventually received 6 separate awards for their heroic actions on Flight 797, including recognition from the Royal Canadian Air Force. But they're all still haunted by the nightmare.
You feel responsible, there's no question. You feel guilt, you're willing to give your license. You feel very, very small until you get all the facts together, and because it's a puzzle for you, you know, you're as much as a victim in this. You're not supposed to fly an airplane in that condition, you know, so you're as much as a victim as the passenger, and I think it becomes all of our problem, and we're all part of the solution.
It's just a shame we didn't get everybody off. It still bothers me.
A 747 plummets towards the Pacific Ocean.
People just popped up like popcorn.
Engines 1, 2, and 3 have lost.
This airplane is totally out of control. It is going to crash.
In 2 minutes, China Airlines Flight 006 drops 10 kilometers through the clouds.
Airspeed 270, 280, 290.
The plane begins to tear itself apart as it spirals towards the sea.
And I closed my eye. I thought I was gone.
Altitude 15,000 feet, 12,000 feet, 10,000 feet. Emergency, emergency.
February the 19th, 1985. A China Airlines flight cruises across the Pacific to Los Angeles. At 12,000 meters, it's racing towards the dawn. For the passengers and crew on board, it's past midnight. A two-man relief crew is in charge of the plane as it sails above the ocean on autopilot. The main crew gets several hours off in the middle of the trip, so they're rested for the landing. But Captain Mumyan Ho is restless.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Even though he's not officially on duty yet, Captain Ho returns to the cockpit.
Thought I'd keep you company.
The captain isn't the only one up. Best friends Sexan Canyo and Alex Knoll have something to celebrate.
I feel like I'm in first class.
It's Sexan's 30th birthday.
I have the longest birthday because I just gained my 12 hours back. And we've been drinking champagne, celebrating 41,000 feet in the air. You know, not too many people get to do that.
Bill Peacock is in first class. He's traveled all over the world for the American government.
There was nothing special. It was a routine commercial flight. I had a very nice first-class seat, sat there and read some books, went to sleep.
By now, the plane is nearing the coast of California.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We will shortly be serving you breakfast. For those of you who wish to adjust your watches, the local time in Los Angeles is now 7 a.m.
Sleep well? Very well, sir. Thank you. Good morning, Captain.
After their 5-hour break, the flight crew is reunited in the cockpit. Soon after, the plane runs into some stiff winds.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking.
We're experiencing some light air turbulence. Please fasten your seatbelt.
The autopilot is set to keep the plane flying at 470 kilometers an hour. But with the wind blowing hard, it's increasingly difficult to maintain the speed. For the crew, the bumpy ride suddenly gets more worrying.
Engine 4 is giving us weak thrust.
There's a problem with one of the engines. The flight engineer throttles up the engine, but it doesn't respond.
We're losing speed.
Back in economy, Sexan Canyo has also noticed something.
You notice the light in that wing isn't flashing anymore. So what?
I thought there was some light blinking at the tip of the wing. Looked like a cone. But when I look back this time, I didn't see no cone.
Oh, the light in that wing's still flashing.
I think you had a few, buddy. Have a seat.
In the cockpit, the strange situation suddenly gets much worse.
Engine 4 flamed out.
The fourth engine stops working completely.
Take a look at engine out procedures. Work out a 3-engine cruise altitude.
The problem with the fourth engine isn't a complete surprise. At the pre-flight briefing, Captain Ho was told that a repair crew had worked on engine 4 before the flight. Perhaps the engine still wasn't working properly.
We had a snag advisor on engine 4 before we took off.
Yes, sir.
Maybe that's it.
Without the fourth engine, the plane continues to slow down.
Airspeed 240.
Call Auckland Center and request a lower altitude.
Auckland Center.
Dynasty 006, requesting new altitude.
Dynasty 006, stand by.
Reignite engine 4.
Yes, Captain.
At this altitude, there isn't much oxygen, so the chances of a successful relight are slim.
No response, Captain.
As the crew try to restart their engine, their plane slowly begins to roll to the right.
Dynasty 006, you're cleared to flight 240.
We're banking right, Captain. Airspeed 230.
As the plane continues to turn and slow down, it's in danger of stalling.
Altitude hold off. Nose down.
Hoping to increase his speed, Captain Ho tries pushing the plane's nose down. Nothing the crew does seems to help. Their jet is banking more and more steeply.
Dynasty Flight 006, Oakland Center, how do you hear me?
Airspeed 220. We're banking right, Captain.
I'm disengaging autopilot.
For the first time, Captain Ho takes manual control of the plane. He struggles with the controls, but the plane has veered into thick cloud, and he can't see the horizon as he tries to keep his jet level.
I've lost ADI.
The ADIs have malfunctioned.
It's going out of limits.
Just minutes after their fourth engine stopped working, the China Airlines flight suddenly stalls and begins falling from the sky.
People just popped up like popcorn, hitting the cabin, and all the tray was flying. Hot tea, pots, noodles, and all the luggage in the compartment were hitting people.
You could hear rivets popping. It sounded like bullets were hitting the outside of the aircraft, which, you know, we're out in the middle of the ocean. Nobody's shooting at us.
At that time, we didn't know we were going to live or die.
China Airlines Flight 006 is out of control and hurtling towards the ocean. A China Airlines jet is tumbling out of the sky. After losing power to one engine, the jet is spinning out of control. It's dropping fast, straight towards the Pacific Ocean.
You can see the stewardesses, all these people who didn't have their seatbelt on, they were flying.
Dynasty 006, Oakland Center, how do you hear me?
The crew are stunned, blindsided by their jet's bizarre behavior.
Engines 1, 2, and 3 have lost thrust. respond, Captain!
Dynasty 006, Oakland Center, how do you hear me?
Airspeed 270, 280,
Dynasty 006, Oakland Center, how do you hear me?
Struggling against the plane's wild motion, the flight engineer tries again to restart his fourth engine.
Ignition negative!
The G-forces are so powerful that the flight engineer is pinned to the control pedestal.
Dynasty 006, Oakland Center, do you copy? You need to see this.
In Oakland, air traffic control spots the plane's sudden descent. In a matter of seconds, the plane falls almost 3,000 meters.
up to 370, 360, 350.
In the cabin, the G-forces are punishing.
And I closed my eye. I thought I was gone. I thought the plane just blew up in the midair.
The plane is about to exceed its maximum speed.
Approaching VMO.
Tumbling madly through the clouds, the 747 finally starts to pull out of its nosedive. As the plane rights itself, the G-forces change direction. The passengers are pressed to the floor, feeling 5 times their normal weight.
I remember looking over at this dignified, older Chinese gentleman who was sitting across the aisle from me, and his face was being contorted like this, like he was lying on his side in a wax museum in a fire. I mean, his face was just all contorted.
As the crew struggles to regain control of the plane, it begins to slow down.
Airspeed 180 knots and falling.
Dynasty 006, Oakland Center, how do you read me?
Airspeed 140 knots and falling.
The jet is still dropping, but not as fast. This could be the crew's chance to regain control.
I knew we were really in trouble because G-forces, instead of being horizontal, started moving around to the vertical. So we were being pushed down into our seats instead of sideways.
As their speed continues to fall, the flight engineer reaches desperately for the engine throttles.
Airspeed 80 knots and falling.
But the engines don't respond.
No response. The engines are flamed out.
After tumbling 3,000 meters in 30 seconds, the jumbo jet plunges again into another free fall.
And the second time when it went down, this time it's plunge. I mean, it went down.
The change is swift. Once again, the passengers feel pulled towards the nose of the plane.
You know, this airplane is totally out of control. It is going to crash. And stuff. We're sliding around and flying around and shoved to one side and then shoved to another side. So it was kind of like being on a boat that gear is broken loose and it's just going back and forth with the waves. Ugly.
My stomach was up to my throat. You smell people urinating in their pants.
I really made peace with the Lord. And I said, to myself, I said, I've really had a wonderful life. If this is the end, I'm ready to do it.
Up to 250. Airspeed 290.
As the plane spins towards the ocean, the airspeed increases rapidly.
Dynasty 006.
With the crews struggling to control the plane, 6 separate calls from air traffic control go unanswered. The stress of the dive tears the landing gear doors off the plane. In less than a minute, the plane drops 6 kilometers.
Hold on! Let's link arms!
He said, I love you, man. I told him I love you, man. And we said goodbye to our wife. And he said something about his belonging. He gave all his belonging to his wife. And that's when we just start pushing our chair back together.
Altitude, 15,000 feet.
With no visible horizon line, Captain Ho doesn't know which way is up.
We pass BMO.
Without a reference, he can't stop the plane from spinning.
Emergency! Emergency!
After blindly plunging thousands of meters, the plane finally breaks free from cloud.
And when this thing was falling down, it looked like you have a magnifying glass and you went like that, and all of a sudden the white water break becoming closer and closer, faster and faster. It's like incredible, and we thought we were going to die.
Altitude, 12,000 feet.
As he struggles for control, Captain Ho has only 30 seconds before his crippled plane smashes into the ocean.
I can see the horizon.
Altitude, 10,000 feet.
For the first time since beginning his harrowing descent, the captain can now use the horizon line as a reference in leveling the plane. As he tries to pull the plane out of its dive, the passengers pay the price. Their bodies are forced into their seats, battered by another dramatic change in direction.
You know, the G-force was so strong, and I weighed 200 pounds, so my weight was almost 1,200 pounds.
It's a race against time, and the plane starts to win.
ADI is coming back.
As the plane finally begins to level, the attitude indicators return to normal.
ADI is coming in.
More importantly, as mysteriously as the incident began, 3 of the plane's engines regain power.
Engines 1, 2, and 3 are coming back. Engine 4 still negative. Reignite engine 4. Yes, Captain.
Once again, the flight engineer tries to reignite the 4th engine. But this time...
Engine 4 reigniting.
For the first time in minutes, the plane is flying under control.
They saved the airplane. They pulled the airplane out of this acrobatic maneuver at an altitude of 9,500 feet. They popped out of the clouds at 11,000 feet, and they had the airplane in stable level flight by 9,500 feet. That was a masterpiece of flying.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain speaking. Is anyone hurt?
Do we have a doctor on board?
There's a gentleman sitting behind me, all splattered with blood from hitting the compartment. So we kept flying, and next thing I knew that the whole plane was quiet, real quiet. Nobody talked very much. If they talked, were whispering, because we don't know, we still don't know we're gonna live or die.
Dynasty 006 fell off my screen, but she's back now.
A new controller, Brian Campbell, has taken over control of Dynasty 006.
Dynasty 006, Oakland Center, do you hear me? Can you fly the plane?
006, we are flamed out. We are... Emergency. We are 9,000. 9,000.
Roger, roger. We have radar contact.
Oakland Center, Dynasty 006, we can control the aircraft.
Roger, roger.
Less than 10 minutes after the start of their problems, everything seems normal again.
Request radar vectors to return to course.
There really is nothing I can do to assist. He's the pilot, he's flying the airplane. I'm going to give him a safe altitude to descend to. I'm giving him a destination. It appeared to me that he was well in control of his aircraft.
Dynasty 006, Oakland Center. Are you declaring an emergency? Do you want to divert to San Francisco?
Negative, Oakland Center. Condition normal now. We will continue to Los Angeles.
Air traffic control clears the plane to climb to 10,500 meters. But a new problem soon arises.
Roger, Oakland Center. Captain, our landing gear is down and walk. Can you bring them up? Negative. The hydraulic fluid in System 1 is empty.
For some reason, the plane's landing gear is down. Hydraulic fluid, which controls the gear and many other parts of the plane, is also leaking away.
Oakland Center, Dynasty 006, request new clearance to maintain flight level 270.
Dynasty 006, Oakland Center. Do you have injuries?
Stand by, Oakland Center.
Sir, are you okay? My head.
One passenger has suffered serious injuries, and 24 others have cuts and bruises.
006, we have at least 2 injuries on board.
Dynasty 006, Oakland Center. Are you declaring an emergency? Do you want to divert to San Francisco?
Stand by, Oakland Center.
Oakland Center, Dynasty 006. We're declaring an emergency. We request a direct route to San Francisco.
Well, they cleared all the other airplanes out of the way. They gave him clear runway, so nobody was waiting. Didn't have to wait for anybody else. He went straight in for a landing.
Dynasty 006, Oakland Center. You are now cleared. You are free to descend at pilot's discretion.
Captain Ho not only has injuries on board, the plane itself has been severely damaged. His rear elevators, which help control the altitude of the plane, don't seem to be working. Without them, landing his jet safely will be extremely difficult.
The problem is, it's a very big airplane and it responds very, very slowly, and you just might not do it before you run out of air. You might hit the ocean. What you need is a very cool head.
Captain Ho must now land using varying amounts of engine thrust. After pulling the plane out of its terrifying dive, if he makes one mistake, Flight 006 could still end in disaster. Nearing the end of a trip across the Pacific Ocean, China Airlines Flight 006 falls suddenly from the sky.
No response! The engine is flamed out!
Emergency! Emergency!
After a terrifying plunge, the crew manages to wrestle the plane level again. But the jet is badly crippled. The elevators aren't working. Without them, Captain Ho has to land mostly by reducing power to his engines. It's a controlled fall towards the runway.
As we came in, we flew over the house in Atherton where I had lived, where my kids had been born. And I looked down and said, boy, this is fitting. If we don't make it down, or if this plane explodes on landing because it's been so badly torqued and ruptured, you know, at least I got to see that. He made one of the best landings I've ever seen. I mean, it was just perfect touchdown.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Ho speaking. Wishing you a safe journey. I hope you enjoyed our
uneventful flight. Thank you for flying China Airlines.
I thought he was a hero. He saved our life. I mean, how can we fell we didn't know how far we fell at that time. And we thought he was a hero and everything was fine.
On the ground, the full extent of the damage to the plane can be seen.
I saw this enormous piece of extremely complicated machinery that is much larger than most buildings, sitting there on the tarmac with bits ripped off it. Parts of the entire tailplane at the end were ripped off, as though a tornado had come through or a crane had been in and ripped pieces out of it. It was a very sobering experience.
It's clear why the crew had such a hard time landing the plane. Enormous chunks of the tail are missing, either torn off by the stress of the dive or crushed when the landing gear doors broke loose. If the damage had been much more severe, the crew wouldn't have been able to regain control of their jet. 24 passengers have minor injuries. Only one requires hospitalization, but is soon released. A near disaster was avoided. But what had gone wrong in the first place? The National Transportation Safety Board arrived that very day and launched their investigation. The cockpit voice recorder is sent to Washington, but it's designed to tape over itself every 30 minutes. None of what happened in the cockpit during the terrifying plunge from the sky remains.
Without a cockpit voice recorder, we had to reconstruct what the crew said and how they interpreted things and what was going on in the cockpit to the best of our abilities with the other data that was available to us.
A record of the plane's instrument activity during the flight has been captured by the flight data recorder. But again, the team runs into a problem. The flight data recorder experienced unprecedented stress during the dive. There were electrical interruptions too, which caused gaps in the recording. The FDR information will have to be recovered using painstaking techniques of reconstruction. It's a frustrating start to the investigation. Investigators begin with what they do have. Passengers and crew report that just before the failure of the jet's fourth engine, the plane flew through unexpected turbulence. Had this caused the engine to fail? Satellite weather maps reveal that there was indeed heavy air turbulence over the Pacific. But it wasn't severe enough to cause engine failure. The jet's 4 engines are tested and studied. Even after the horrific dive through the sky, they're found to be in working order. However, given the previous history of problems with Engine 4, it receives particular scrutiny.
They had an anomaly with one of the engines. They believed that the engine had flamed out or that there was something seriously wrong with the engine.
The wear on a small throttle valve trimmer is measured. It's worn down by only 4/1000th of an inch, but that's enough to restrict the fuel flow to Engine 4.
Engine 4 is giving us good thrust.
Investigators determined that at 12,000 meters, Engine 4 did indeed deliver weaker than normal thrust. It's known as a hung engine. The aircraft logbook reveals that Engine 4 had been written up on 2 previous occasions just the week before. Perhaps the engine wasn't properly fixed, which led to the China Airlines mishap. The NTSB decided to dig deeper into the history of maintenance on Engine 4.
We had a snag advisor on Engine 4 before we took off.
Yes, sir.
Maybe that's it.
But after weeks of investigation, the NTSB concludes that the engine didn't need to be replaced. All the repairs were done according to the book. A faulty engine was not the cause of the accident. And even with the loss of one engine, the plane shouldn't have been in immediate danger.
Engine 4 flamed out.
A 747 is designed to fly on only 3 engines.
The loss of thrust on a 4-engine airplane is a minor event. It's an event, you have to take care of it, but the airplane is easily retrimmed and the airplane will fly on 3 engines with no difficulty.
We're banking right, Captain. Airspeed 230.
The airplane is perfectly capable of flying. It's not as efficient because it's got this big, round, drag-producing device out there, not producing any thrust. But given that it's not going to get quite so many miles per gallon, otherwise it's perfectly flyable.
Take a look at engine out procedures. Work out a 3-engine cruise altitude. Yes, Captain.
There are standard procedures to follow in the case of an engine failure, but the crew of the China Airlines flight hadn't followed them. They tried to reignite the engine immediately instead of descending.
Reignite engine 4.
Yes, Captain.
They attempted a restart much too high. You are supposed to attempt to restart an engine only below 30,000 feet. They were at 41,000.
What is a little curious to me is why they didn't use the normal relight procedure. They were starting to try to relight the engine at altitude, and that would likely not relight.
No response, Captain.
It's a mistake, but it shouldn't have led to the plane spiraling out of control. So how had a manageable problem turned into a near disaster?
I've lost ADI.
The ADIs have malfunctioned.
It's going out of limits.
To get more information on what was happening in the cockpit, investigators interview the flight crew.
I heard the captain report the ADI was lost. And then I saw the standby ADI was also going out of limits.
The crew tell investigators that their ADIs, which measure how level the plane is, weren't working.
They could have said, this can't possibly be right. And looking at their indicators, can't possibly be right, and therefore they must have failed.
The attitude indicator had indicated a position so implausible that it looked like it had to be a failed instrument. This couldn't be what the plane was really doing.
But in fact, when the ADIs are studied by the NTSB, they're all found to be perfectly normal.
When we started banking right, engine 4 was already flamed out. We started to descend faster, and engines 1, 2, and 3 also failed.
Engines 1, 2, and 3 have lost thrust!
NTSB investigators are even more confused when the crew tells them that all of their engines had failed.
No response, Captain!
With the exception of engine 4, the flight data recorder indicates that the other 3 engines were working the entire flight.
Ignition negative!
If the engines had all failed, there would have been a host of other problems, such as cabin depressurization, but that didn't happen.
Engines 1, 2, and 3 are coming back.
Finally, when we descended lower in altitude, 1, 2, and 3 came back, and we were able to reignite engine number 4.
Engine 4 reignited.
At the end of the dive, the crew had the plane under full power. It was a remarkable recovery. But to investigators, it's a puzzle. The story the crew is telling doesn't match up with the evidence they've uncovered. After months of investigation, the NTSB team slowly pieced together a reenactment of the plane's near catastrophe over the Pacific. It includes information from the reconstructed flight recorder, personal interviews, and the air traffic control transcript. When the work is complete, there's only one conclusion. Apart from a problem with a small valve, there was nothing wrong with the 747 before it plunged from the sky. In fact, it was the crew that made a series of fateful decisions that almost crashed the plane. Just after 10 o'clock Pacific time, engine 4 starts to lose thrust.
Engine 4 is giving us weak thrust.
The flight engineer struggles to fix the problem. But investigators discover that he doesn't take one of the most basic steps he should have. He leaves the engine's bleed air valve on. The bleed air valve takes air generated by the engine to help cool the plane. When an engine isn't working properly, the valve is supposed to be closed, so the engine can use all available air to restart.
It's a little puzzling that the flight engineer didn't shut off bleed air. And in my mind, the most likely reason for it is that he didn't expect to be told to restart the engine at 41,000 feet. And so when the captain instructed him to try some restarts, he just kind of wasn't ready with his checklist. He was doing something out of order. And that's why it didn't occur to him to shut down the bleed air. The end result is that the engine, which is slow to start, won't start at all.
Unwittingly, the flight engineer has started a ticking clock. Engine 4 is slowly losing its ability to stay lit.
We're losing speed.
With more engine power on the left wing than the right, the China Airlines flight begins turning.
In order to keep it from turning to the right, the proper thing to do would have been to step on the rudder. That would have produced a twisting force, so to speak, that would have overcome the imbalance of the engines.
But instead of adjusting the rudder himself, Captain Ho continues to let the autopilot fly the jet. The autopilot is designed not to move the rudder. The autopilot can adjust the ailerons and spoilers on the plane's wings, but these flaps aren't strong enough to overcome the imbalance that the plane is experiencing. Without the help of the rudder, the plane's turn becomes steeper and steeper.
Now, it's possible that he'd forgotten that the autopilot didn't use the rudder. He may have been assuming all along that the autopilot was just flying the airplane the way a human being would have, which it wasn't.
Engine 4 flamed out.
Investigators discover that after losing power to his fourth engine, Captain Ho continues to leave the autopilot on. He doesn't take complete control of the plane. He doesn't adjust the plane's rudder with his left foot.
Airspeed 240.
He didn't use the rudder to compensate for the lack of thrust on the right outboard engine. The airplane started to lose speed, and one thing led to another, and in the end, it was really that little error of airmanship, the failure to step on that left rudder pedal, that triggered everything else.
Reignite engine 4.
Yes, Captain.
Rather than taking control of flying the plane, Captain Ho's attention seems to be focused on his engine problem, something that his flight engineer could handle on his own.
No response, Captain.
It's really critical that attention be paid to flying the airplane. But it's happened over and over again in aviation that the crew gets focused on a problem with a system, in this case an engine, but it could have been a light bulb, it could have been any other malfunction. And if everybody's focused on that and nobody is flying, then they're not prepared for what's happening to the airplane.
The plane enters a critical moment. It's about to flip on its side and enter a nosedive. The NTSB believes that the captain was concentrating on his airspeed indicator, but seemingly fails to notice the instrument directly beside it, his attitude indicator. This instrument would have warned him that his plane was starting to roll alarmingly to the right.
They concentrated on one part of the phenomenon and lost the full picture. And as they lost the full picture, they lost apparently a very important part of any instrument flying, which is the scan. You look at all of the primary instruments, one after the other, and whatever is going on, you look at them all constantly.
During the plane's nosedive, it flies through thick cloud. With no visual horizon as a reference, the flight crew must trust their instruments to level the plane.
I've lost ADI.
Instead, what investigators believe happened is that the crew became spatially disoriented. They decided that their instruments were failing.
They simply didn't believe what they were seeing, and they thought they had lost their attitude instruments. They hadn't lost their attitude instruments. The airplane was, in fact, embarking on an aerobatic maneuver.
The most probable reason for all three crew members believing something so unlikely as that all attitude indicators could malfunction in the same way at the same time is that the way in which they malfunctioned was so unexpected and strange that it didn't seem to correspond to any possible thing that the airplane could be doing. The airplane had in fact rolled over on its back and gone into a vertical dive, and that's something that Boeing 747s don't typically do.
As the plane begins tumbling towards the ocean, another critical lapse in judgment occurs.
The standby ADI was also going out of limits. I tried to restart.
During interviews, the flight engineer told the NTSB that all 3 of the plane's working engines failed.
We started to descend faster, and engines 1, 2, and 3 also failed.
But the flight data recorder shows that, in fact, they were still working. In the heat of the crisis, the engineer had made an enormous mistake.
Engines 1, 2, and 3 have lost thrust.
The investigation reveals that as the plane fell, the thrust in each engine was indeed reduced dramatically. But the cause wasn't engine trouble. The engine throttles had been lowered to idle in an attempt to slow the furious fall of the jet. It was something the engineer missed in the chaos of the dive.
You can understand why the flight engineer might have been confused about this situation if he had not seen the captain pull the power to idle on the engines. He would reasonably assume that the fact that they went to idle was a problem rather than intentional.
Investigators also believe that they know why the engines didn't give the crew more power when the engineer tried to throttle them up. The cold temperatures at 9,000 meters would stop them from responding quickly.
No response, Captain!
But in the heat of the moment, the engineer could have taken their slow response as another indication that they failed. The NTSB discovers that indeed gauges in the generator panel behind the engineer showed that the 3 engines were still firing.
Ignition negative!
But the gravitational force became so powerful, the engineer couldn't look back. After months of painstaking recreation, the NTSB investigators believe they understand what happened inside the cockpit of China Airlines Flight 006. But what they don't understand is why. The crew's medical records are examined. Was there something wrong with the captain that might explain the bizarre behavior? Nothing turns up.
You know, it wasn't just the 3 stooges who, won a trip on a 747 or something. It was a trained crew, highly experienced, thousands of hours.
How could an experienced crew make so many fundamental mistakes? The investigators find the answers in the hours before the incident. What they uncover is a potential danger that affects pilots around the world. In 1985, a series of small pilot errors lead to a terrifying plunge from the sky. Spinning wildly out of control, a China Airlines flight tumbled 10 kilometers towards the Pacific Ocean. By the time the crew regained control, the plane was badly damaged. Amazingly, everyone on board survived. Investigators have uncovered a series of mistakes which nearly led to the death of everyone on board China Airlines Flight 006. But how could an experienced, well-trained and healthy crew make so many mistakes? The NTSB team decides to examine all of the factors affecting human behavior, including a new field of research.
For the first time, as far as I know, in a report, the circadian rhythms, the biorhythms, the day and night functioning of the body was seriously taken into account as a possible explanation of why an extremely experienced Boeing 747 captain didn't notice things that to other pilots might have seemed obvious, such as the fact that his airplane was busy flipping on his back when he was attempting to deal with an engine problem.
Although Captain Ho had the required 15 hours off duty before flying that day, the NTSB investigators take a closer look at the captain's schedule before the night of the flight.
I do not think I was fatigued. I can't say I slept well during the flight.
This accident occurred at what would be about 2 a.m. local time. And that's pretty significant. Most people are asleep around 2 a.m. So this incident occurred at a point in his what are called circadian rhythms in his body clock, where he would be at his deepest sleep. I remember also that he had gone back into, there was a crew rest area on the 747, and he said he'd rested for 5 hours and slept for 2. But another thing I remember from his interview is he said, you never really sleep well on the airplane.
Captain never sleep well during the flight. I worked many years for this airline, but I never had this problem before.
That seemed like a very true statement. You know, it's hard to get a really solid sleep on the airplane, particularly if you're the person in command, as he was. So, putting it all together, we saw this was an experienced crew, a qualified crew, and they were flying on a schedule that would make them susceptible to some of the negative or adverse effects of fatigue.
During 6 flights in the previous 6 days, Captain Ho had covered a total of 18 time zones.
Thought I'd keep you company.
The NTSB research suggests that desynchronisis, or jet lag, may have been a cause.
And I think all these factors certainly would have contributed to his being performing at less than his full potential at the time.
Investigators also take a closer look at the very machinery that is supposed to make long-distance flying easier.
Take a look at engine out procedures. Work out a 3-engine cruise altitude. Yes, Captain.
We have people in the front of airplanes because we believe that in circumstances which nobody has foreseen, the human being in the front of the airplane can react creatively, can solve a problem that nobody has thought about before in real time. And automation can't solve problems that nobody has thought about before in real time in quite the same way.
The NTSB concludes that possibly fatigued from air travel and bored by the monotony of his tasks,
We're banking right, Captain.
I'm disengaging autopilot.
the captain relied on his autopilot for too long. When he should have taken direct control, he hesitated, trusting his systems.
That is obviously a failure. The crew didn't behave as they should have behaved. Pilot error.
As a result of the China Airlines near mishap and other incidents around the same time, aircraft manufacturers began to rethink the design of their automated systems.
The idea of the automation is that it's going to help the human do the human's job. It's going to help the human take the airplane from the gate to the gate at the other end, and it's going to help along the way.
Boeing makes use of this particular incident to say we still want the crew to have full authority so that they can move the controls as far as it's physically possible to move them and to manage the airplane, even if it may bend the airplane. It is better to do that than to restrict the pilot's authority and then have him guess whether or not he's in charge or the computer's in charge.
Whatever mistakes the flight crew made that day, they did succeed in their ultimate task.
They flew the airplane well. They did an excellent job with the approach afterward. They were careful with the airplane. They knew the airplane had been damaged. They didn't know the severity of it. They were gentle with the maneuvering and yet tested enough to make sure that they wouldn't get themselves in further trouble as they made the approach to landing.
The one big thing they did right, and one only ever needs to do one big thing, is they saved the airplane. And in principle, that's all you ever need to do right when something happens to your airplane. You need to save the airplane and you need to save the passengers, and that's what they did.
How can you forget something like that? That I survived through that. So it's hard for me to forget that I was lucky and it wasn't my time yet.
The pilot saved our lives. He got us into it, but he got us out of it.
And perhaps there was one other hero that day, the Boeing 747 itself. It was put through maneuvers and stresses that far outweighed its known limits. And yet, despite it all, the aircraft survived and landed safely. In the dark of night, over the Red Sea, a pilot struggles to control his passenger jet. The plane seems to have a life of its own.
I heard a scream, a noise. After that, I didn't hear anything.
The sands of Egypt hide thousands of years of history. Monuments to ancient civilizations dominate the landscape. But for sun-loving Europeans, Egypt is also a resort destination, where the most important sand is on the beach. The town of Sharm el-Sheikh is several hundred kilometers southeast of Cairo. Perched on the Red Sea, it's a natural destination for people looking for a little rest and relaxation.
Sharm el-Sheikh is quite popular with Europeans. The reason is, where can you get very warm sea with a 5-hour flight? And you have the Red Sea, which is crystal clear, beautiful mountains. It's just extraordinary.
The city's popularity is growing. More than 4 million people a year use Sharm el-Sheikh's airport. In the early days of 2004, tourists aren't the only ones drawn to the local beaches. British Prime Minister Tony Blair is also in the region visiting Egyptian leader Hosni Mubarak. Just after 2 in the morning on January the 3rd, many vacationers are still out on the town. But 53-year-old Captain Kader Abdullah is just starting his day. He's renowned for his punctuality. A former officer in the Egyptian Air Force, Kader is now a highly respected captain with the charter company Flash Airlines.
He always liked to pack his own suitcase. He wouldn't let me do it for him. He always said, I would like to prepare my own things to make sure I don't forget anything. He was very precise on what he wanted and what he would take with him.
Captain Kader meets up with his 25-year-old first officer, Amr el-Shafi. Together, they'll fly out of Sharm el-Sheikh heading for Paris.
Good morning.
Good morning, sir.
El-Shafi is young enough to be the captain's son. The early morning flight isn't for everyone. Pascal Mercier and his family are supposed to be on the Flash jet, but changed their plans.
I was booked on the Flash Island flight. When my agency told me that I had to wake up very early and then we had to change planes in Cairo, I said, this is really stupid. I mean, if my daughter was like 2 years old and the other ones were like 6 and 8. So really, I didn't feel comfortable about changing planes and so on.
For other tourists, the cheap tickets that Flash offers are worth the trouble of getting up early. France Toulier was able to bring his entire family to Egypt. They need the break.
My brother-in-law had just lost his father, so he brought his children, his mother, and his wife there just to have a good time. Not to see the sights or anything, just to have a good time. That's what Sharm el-Sheikh is known for.
Fatima Hijaji is also heading back to Paris after a vacation in Sharm. The mother of 5 is flying alone. Before takeoff, she calls her nephew in France.
Hi.
I was asleep when she called. I didn't really want to get into a conversation with her. She was someone who called you for everything. She needed to be reassured. So, even though she had the 5 or 6 hour flight ahead of her, she just wanted to make sure that I would be there to pick her up at the airport.
In all, 148 passengers and crew settle into their seats aboard the jet. It's 5 a.m. In the cockpit, Ashraf Abdel Hamid is the 3rd member of the crew. He's training as a first officer, although he's worked for years piloting corporate jets.
Temperature 12, dew point 01.
None of the crew members are happy with the poor quality of the weather information they're getting from the local air traffic controller.
They didn't say sky clear, they said clouds and sky clear. How? The two are opposite.
Ask him about ceiling.
No ceiling and clouds and sky clear.
Maybe it's scattered.
Maybe he means scatter.
Good morning.
The captain is also frustrated that one of his instruments isn't working. Although the engineer agrees there's a problem, it's not serious enough to fix.
Especially electrical.
The men laugh it off at the expense of the first officer.
It's probably caused by Ma making a heavy landing.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Captain Kadir and his entire crew, we welcome you on board Flash Airlines Boeing 737-300.
It's still hours before dawn when the plane lifts off. The Flash Airlines flight will head out over the Red Sea before turning towards Cairo. The jet climbs through a pitch-black night. Without a moon to light the scene, it's hard for the passengers to see much of anything outside their windows. In the cockpit, the simple turn over the Red Sea is taking a bizarre twist.
See what the aircraft just did?
Captain Kader doesn't like the way his plane is behaving.
Turning right, sir.
What?
Aircraft is turning right.
Turning right? How turning right?
The plane is supposed to be turning left on its way to Cairo. Instead, it's turning in the opposite direction.
Okay. Out.
The captain tries to get his plane back on course, but his situation just gets worse.
Overbank.
Knowing he's in trouble, the captain tells the first officer to engage the autopilot.
Autopilot! Autopilot!
But it doesn't work.
No autopilot, Commander!
The 737 is now flying almost completely on its side.
Something's wrong with the plane!
The plane gains speed as it spirals towards the Red Sea. Just minutes after takeoff, the plane is out of control. Diving towards the water, it's traveling at more than 700 kilometers an hour. Everyone on board is running out of time. Just minutes after takeoff, an early morning flight has become a desperate battle for survival. A passenger jet filled with French families is plunging towards the Red Sea. Everyone on board can feel the tremendous speed and gut-wrenching turns. The enormous G-forces are making it difficult for Captain Kader Abdullah to fly the plane. Ashraf Abdel Hamid, the third member of the flight crew, tells the captain to slow the plane down.
Retard power! Retard power! Retard power!
The plane is traveling so fast it's threatening to tear itself apart. After flying almost upside down, the crew is finally beginning to bring their plane under control. Then they hear the ground proximity warning. They're getting dangerously close to the Red Sea. Pascal Mercier and his family are staying at a beachfront hotel.
My daughter woke up suddenly screaming like hell, screaming like if something happened. I didn't hear the crash, but maybe she did.
It's okay.
It's just before 5 in the morning, minutes after the plane took off from the airport. It's disappeared from local radar screens. By the time the sun rises, the crash site is found, but there's little for rescuers to do. The plane shattered on impact. A postcard is found saying simply, "I think this card will arrive after me." Pieces of debris litter the surface, but most of the plane has sunk beneath the waves. There are no survivors. All 148 people on board the plane are dead. Flight 604 was to land at Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris in the morning. As family and friends wait, officials list the plane as delayed and then slowly break the news of the accident.
They ask me, "Are you waiting for someone from Sharm el-Sheikh?" You say, "Yes." Then they say, "Could you come with us? We are going to take you to a hotel. At the hotel, we'll explain it all to you."
It was very strange since we were greeted in an hotel and we passed people who were leaving happy because they were looking for the same information as us, but their families were not on the list.
They came with a paper in hand. "Here, yes, Madame Hijaji, Fatima. We apologize that you have to learn it this way, but she's dead."
Later, on his voicemail, Mohammed Hijaji hears Fatima's message sent during the flight.
I heard a scream, a noise. After that, I didn't hear anything.
Captain Kader's wife hears about the crash from her son.
My son called me from abroad and told me that he had heard there was an accident in Flash Airlines. I was in disbelief for a while until it became reality. It was a very big shock for me.
In resort hotels, workers check the empty rooms of those who were on Flight 604. But one of the rooms is occupied.
Mr. Mercy.
This guy from the hotel, the hotel staff, began to cry. He was really shocked, happily shocked to see us. He thought we were in the flight with everybody else.
They're here.
In my hotel, 82 people were on that flight. 82 people. It was really, really strange. Really, really heavy. But we were really lucky.
There had been no Mayday call from the plane, no warning to air traffic control that something was wrong. With the plane crashing just minutes after it left the airport, there are immediate concerns that a bomb had brought the jet down.
The plane had just taken off, and it looked very strange why this accident happened so quickly after takeoff.
When investigators examined the plane's flight path, they discover it would have gone directly over the town where Egyptian leader Hosni Mubarak kept a vacation home. It's also close to the house where British Prime Minister Tony Blair and his family were staying. Blair and his family were supposed to leave from the same airport that day. Security around the Prime Minister is immediately heightened. 2 days after the crash, authorities receive a phone call. Terrorists from Yemen claim responsibility for the crash. They say it's a protest against a French law banning the Muslim headscarf, the hijab, in public schools. But in spite of the phone call and the rumors swirling around Egypt, investigators quickly rule out terrorism.
If you have a wreckage distributed on a very large area, that means the plane was disintegrating in the air, and due to an explosion, it would be disintegrating on a wide area. In this case, there was very, very few pieces, and all located in a very small area. So this indicated that the plane was intact and went into the water intact.
If it wasn't terrorism, what had ripped the plane from the sky so quickly? Investigators face an enormous challenge. The plane has sunk below the surface of the Red Sea. Divers have to fight off sharks that are drawn to the carnage. The rescue teams find few bodies intact. The aircraft and most of the 148 passengers and crew have sunk over 1,000 meters to the bottom of the Red Sea. The first task of investigators is to find the aircraft's flight data and cockpit voice recorders, the black boxes. If they survived the crash, they will now be on the seabed. But this part of the Red Sea has never been charted. With so many French tourists involved, the French government offers to help in any way it can.
The French immediately responded by sending a boat specially equipped with robots to search the bottom of the sea.
But the wreckage is too deep. The sub that the French boat has can't survive the enormous pressure at the bottom of the sea. The investigators desperately need another submarine. But they're running out of time. The black box transmits a radio signal, but the battery only lasts for 30 days. If investigators can't find it within a month, the mystery of Flight 604 may never be solved.
Getting to the black boxes before the time the pingers stopped transmitting was always a very worrisome aspect to all the investigation team. Everybody was working 24 hours, round the clock, to try to salvage these and try to locate them first.
While the recovery effort continues, family and friends of the victims begin to mourn those who died. They pressure investigators to solve the mystery.
It's the biggest air disaster involving French nationals, the biggest in the history of civil aviation.
American, French, and Egyptian experts join forces. While waiting for the plane's black boxes to be recovered, they also begin focusing on Flash Airlines itself. Flying just 2 planes, it was one of a number of low-cost charter companies that had been competing for customers in Europe. In the last 10 years, there had been a rapid expansion of budget airlines throughout this part of the world. Offering inexpensive, no-frills service, they fought for a piece of the holiday market. Seaside resorts like Sharm el-Sheikh were one of the many destinations they serve.
Now, one of the ways in which they provide this extremely cheap travel is by operating their aeroplanes 24 hours a day.
Operating on such tight schedules means the planes are flown constantly. Former Flash passengers step forward to complain about other flights. There are a lot of stories.
I was flying home after a vacation.
A year before the crash, while flying from Sharm el-Sheikh to Bologna, one passenger recalls seeing flames pouring from a Flash Airlines jet.
Hey! Hey! The engine's on fire! Look! Please!
The flaming aircraft is forced to make an emergency landing. Investigators learned that in 2002, the Swiss Aviation Authority performed a surprise inspection on the same plane that would later crash. The pilot's oxygen masks are missing. There aren't enough oxygen tanks. Some of the cockpit instruments aren't working. It's enough for the Swiss to ground the flight for 8 hours until the company repairs the plane. A few days later, Flash Airlines was banned from flying in Switzerland. Another ban occurred in Poland. In Norway, tour operators stopped contracting with Flash.
It's a rare event for an airline to be banned from operating into a country. They had to have done something dramatically wrong, especially when it comes to safety.
With mounting concerns about the safety record of Flash Airlines, investigators combed through the company's paperwork. They discover that the most recent maintenance records for the plane that crashed were never duplicated. They've gone missing with the aircraft.
The lack of having copies of the technical log and all of them being on board, of course, this is a violation. And civil aviation here issued very clear instructions that this should not happen.
The French authorities agree that there are serious questions about Flash. They now ban the company from flying in France. While there are concerns about the state of the company's planes, there are no such issues when it comes to the crew of Flight 604. Captain Kader was considered not only a flying ace, but a national war hero for his performance in the Yom Kippur War. During his career, he not only flew sophisticated fighter jets, but also a variety of large cargo aircraft. He had over 7,000 hours of flying experience, as well as 2,000 hours as a flight instructor. All the evidence shows that Captain Kader was a model pilot. With the aircraft and its black box data recorders still hidden deep under the Red Sea, investigators wonder, was this a case of a superb pilot fighting to save a decrepit plane?
See what the aircraft did?
On a moonless January night, a Flash Airlines 737 spiraled wildly into the Red Sea. All 148 people on board were killed. Investigators trying to find out why the plane went down have uncovered a history of safety problems with the airline. But trying to prove that there was anything wrong with the plane that crashed is difficult. Much of the wreckage has sunk deep beneath the waves. Investigators have been unable to find the flight's black boxes.
Whenever an airplane crashes into the water, there's always a fear by investigators that the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder may not be recovered. Those two boxes in and of themselves give the investigator a very good picture, and without them could make the investigation process very, very difficult.
Finally, after several days of searching, a breakthrough. A French research ship hears the locator signals given off by the black boxes. A remotely operated sub drops down over 1,000 meters. The violence of the crash has spread the wreckage over a wide area. 2 weeks after the crash, both the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder are recovered from the bottom of the sea. Investigators finally have some hard evidence. The Egyptian, French, and American team examines the critical devices in Cairo. After the two black boxes are found, the salvage effort wraps up. Other than a select number of small pieces, the rest of the plane is too deep to recover. The cost to continue would be too great. Without the wreckage itself, investigators concentrate on what they do have. They hope the black boxes will recreate the final minutes of the doomed plane.
One of the things we did to depict the path of the aircraft was we created an animation based on the data we got from the flight data recorder and from radar.
The flight data recorder paints a devastating picture. Shortly after takeoff, the plane began heading left, just as it was supposed to. But then it quickly started banking in the other direction. The cockpit voice recorder shows that the turn caught the captain off guard.
Turning right, sir.
What? How turning right?
Analyzing the cockpit voice recorder, it showed that the pilots were experiencing definitely some kind of an abnormality, a problem that they could not understand.
The investigators sift through the flight data to find some explanation for the jet's bizarre movement. Perhaps some mechanical fault was forcing the plane off course. And there is an indication that something was wrong with the flash jet before it took off. On the runway, the captain and the ground engineer discussed an electrical malfunction. But it's impossible to tell from the cockpit voice recorder exactly what the problem was.
Especially electrical.
On n'a pas de certitude sur le dispositif. We can't be sure which equipment was being referred to by the aircraft captain and the engineer when they were discussing faulty equipment. Not enough parts were brought up from the bottom of the sea to be able to determine that.
Pour pouvoir dire.
And tragically, the ground engineer was also on the flight.
We believe from the data we are looking at in the flight data recorder that there is a very high possibility that the plane was tending to turn to the right by itself.
But what exactly had gone wrong? A thorough accident investigation can take years. But in the case of Flash Flight 604, there are unique challenges.
The problem with accident investigation is that it's very time-consuming and resource-intensive, especially when we don't have an airplane to physically look at. You want to be absolutely sure of the facts, conditions, and circumstances before you publish that information.
Family and friends of the victims are becoming more and more frustrated. As the months pass, they demand answers.
We were led to protest outside the Egyptian embassy because we had no news. 11 months after the disaster, we had no message, no information.
Shortly after the protest, Egyptian investigators release a factual report. It contains all of the information from the black boxes, but the report does not reach any conclusions about why the jet crashed.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening.
With a situation as complicated as this one, the investigators don't yet have any answers. The only thing they can do is to keep looking. Investigators discuss several possible scenarios that could have been responsible for the plane's erratic course.
You look into every hypothetical scenario that would create a similar profile. And then you see if this profile fit the data that you have put together.
50 different theories are examined in minute detail.
In the process of looking into all the possible hypothetical scenarios, we proceeded by eliminating those that did not fit the data.
Investigators travel to the United States to test the most likely ideas in a sophisticated simulator. If they can force the simulator to repeat the movements of the flash jet, they might be able to figure out why the plane crashed. The results are brought back to Cairo. There are only 4 mechanical faults that could have produced the flight path of the doomed jet. Investigators believe the key to the crash is to find out why the plane began turning off course.
These 4 scenarios were all related to what would cause an uncommanded bank. So we were left with these as causes that we could not rule out.
2 of the scenarios involved the spoilers on the plane's right wing. Spoilers lift up from the top surface of the wing, slowing it down. By producing drag or spoiling the airflow, they help turn the aircraft. If the pilot's control wheel or the cables that connect it to the spoiler jammed, it could have forced the plane off course. Problems with the spoilers are one explanation, but there's no physical proof. And while there were maintenance problems with flash planes, none of them had to do with the jet's spoilers. The team searches for another explanation. Another potential cause of the crash is the plane's ailerons. This part of a plane's wing controls the angle of a plane's turn. A malfunctioning aileron could have caused the plane to roll to the right. Again, if the crew couldn't fix the problem, the plane would have begun to spiral into the sea. While so-called aileron trim runaway would create a flight path like the one seen during the crash, once again, there's no physical proof to support the theory. And typically, aileron trim runaway can be physically overcome by pilots.
All he would have had to do was overpower using more force to move the control wheel in an opposite direction.
Overbanked.
When they listen to the cockpit voice recorder, the investigators are puzzled by the constant discussion of the plane's autopilot.
Autopilot.
The captain asked for the autopilot to be turned on, but it had no effect and the plane began to plummet to the sea. And earlier in the cockpit recording, investigators uncover another curious exchange. Captain Kader began the initial turn over the Red Sea manually, but decided to let the autopilot take over.
Autopilot.
The flight data recorder shows that the autopilot was indeed turned on as the plane climbed.
Not yet.
But then the captain appears to change his mind. The plane's flight data recorder shows that the autopilot was only activated for 3 seconds. But investigators wonder if the autopilot had malfunctioned and stayed in command of the jet. The automated system could have continued to control the plane, flying it to the right, even after the pilots thought it had been disengaged.
The malfunction of the autopilot, of course, took a lot of work from us because it was nearly impossible to show that it did not happen, and quite impossible to show that it did happen. So, but it was always a very prominent possibility because it would give a very, very close scenario to what was happening.
Perhaps most puzzling of all, though, is that no matter what happened to the plane, it appeared to be under control just before it crashed. Moments before impact, the captain was seemingly back in command of his airplane. If there had been some crippling mechanical problem, why did it seem to disappear? Some members of the team want to consider something besides mechanical fault: the pilots themselves.
I think the major concern for the United States was that the human factors elements of this accident weren't thoroughly explored.
Perhaps the high esteem given to Egyptian pilots was getting in the way.
In Egypt, pilots are very respected, and in particular, Air Force pilots are very highly regarded. For the past 26 years, the country's president has been a highly decorated Air Force officer. In an environment like this, the pilot is somewhat immune to suspicion. When something goes wrong, the natural tendency is to blame the equipment.
And on this flight, the pilot was a war hero with thousands of hours of experience. Studying the flight data recorders again, the investigators discover something peculiar. Even before the plane's bizarre turn to the right, 3 things all seem to happen at the same time. Instead of a smooth left turn, the plane begins to come out of its turn early. The nose starts to rise, and the plane's airspeed decreases noticeably. But during this time, the pilot says nothing. It seems that he's unaware of the changes to his flight path.
I've flown out of Sharm el-Sheikh at nighttime and in the same type of aircraft. And in no way should the pilot allow the airspeed to drop by as much as 30 knots, or the bank angle to change beyond 5 degrees without clearly stating the reasons for the change in the flight path.
Some investigators consider a provocative theory that might explain this seemingly bizarre behavior. Perhaps Captain Kader had been affected by vertigo.
Vertigo is a physiological condition that would exist with any person, not just pilots, and it's based on the inner ear. Over a dark ocean, without a defined visual horizon, no ground lights, the pilot may not be able to perceive visually whether he was flying up, down, left, or right. And if the fluid in his inner ear was moving or he tilted his head, that may induce a sensation, a physiological sensation, that may cause the pilot to believe the airplane is flying straight and level when it's actually turning.
The plane's flight path is ideal for creating a sense of vertigo. The Flash airline jet took off into a moonless night. Captain Kader was flying manually and began to turn as he was climbing. Heading out over dark water, it would be very difficult using just his senses for Captain Kader to know exactly where he was.
Roger, when ready, inshallah. Left turn to establish 306, Sharm VOR.
It is actually a very high workload situation, and when there are no visual cues outside because it's a moonless night and you're over featureless territory with no lights in it, you really, as a professional pilot, should be totally aware of the fact that this is a situation in which you could get disorientated. It's a classic. It's happened so many times. It's killed so many people in the last 10 years.
When the plane was supposed to be turning slowly left, the control wheel began inching towards the right. Perhaps the captain was making the turn without even being aware of it.
When you study the movement of the aircraft control surfaces, it appears that something was guiding Captain Cutter to the right. Now, that could have been a false horizon or something he's seen outside of his window.
See what the aircraft just did?
Or perhaps he believed he was actually correcting a problem with the plane itself.
He thinks he's gained his flight path again. And all of a sudden, at this moment, he receives contradictory information.
Turning right, sir.
What?
Aircraft is turning right.
The contradictory information adds to the pilot's confusion. He believes he's fixing a problem when he's told his problems have just started.
In this particular instance, not only are you trying to fly the airplane and understand situationally what's happening, but you're going through the mental gymnastics because your expectations are one way. Meanwhile, you have the first officer who's telling him something that's totally different.
Aircraft is turning right.
Egyptian investigators agree that Captain Kader may have suffered some form of disorientation during the flight. But they don't believe it was the only problem the crew was dealing with.
I don't really have a very clear indication that there was disorientation, but it's possible. There was a recovery from disorientation. The time to find out the problem and take the corrective action needed was more than the time left before impact.
No matter what role disorientation played in the crash, investigators are about to learn that the crew wasn't properly trained to deal with it. Flash Airlines never provided the pilots with basic information that could have saved their lives. It's been 2 years since an Egyptian charter plane smashed into the Red Sea. 148 people were killed. Investigators trying to figure out why Flash Airlines Flight 604 crashed face immense challenges. Most of the wreck is still deep underwater. By carefully examining the plane's black boxes, the investigators believe that disorientation may have played a role in the accident. The pitch-black night and the featureless sea caused the pilot to become confused about what was happening. But mechanical problems may also have plagued the plane. As they continue to try to solve the mystery, investigators make a startling discovery. Officials at Flash Airlines reveal that they hadn't provided the pilots with crew resource management training, although it was a requirement for the company. It might have helped the crew deal with their horrifying situation.
Crew resource management is a program where pilots are trained to work together rather than as individuals. Had the pilots of Flash Air 604 received a formal CRM training program, the outcome of this flight may have been substantially different.
American investigators believe the very junior first officer may have felt the plane was in trouble before the captain did, but failed to offer suggestions to his much more experienced co-worker.
What?
Aircraft is turning right.
Nor did he attempt to take control of the plane.
Formal CRM training would have empowered the first officer who had the best situational awareness and the most information about the position of the airplane to take command of the airplane when he saw that the captain wasn't taking the appropriate corrective action.
An earlier conversation in the cockpit before takeoff may reveal why the young first officer would have been reluctant to challenge the captain.
Yesterday, we were coming in at dusk and the sun was 2-2. I felt I could hardly see the runway. And he's already saying, in sight. What in sight?
Hey, sir.
It may not have meant to be insulting, but it may have reinforced the first officer's feeling that he was the student and the captain was the teacher.
I am unable to raise my eyes, and he says, in sight. Where in sight?
It is going to serve as negative feedback. The young first officer is bound to hesitate. He doesn't want to be wrong again. He doesn't want to lose the respect of an Air Force general.
In a crew, an effort must be made to bring together people who are able to co-pilot, not a crew in which one person pilots and the other person looks on without saying a word.
But the captain and the co-pilot weren't alone in the cockpit. A third crew member with more experience than the first officer was also there.
Maybe it's scattered.
He too never said anything until the final seconds of the flight.
Otherwise, how will we know when we clear the cloud?
We hear him speak very clearly and very openly all during the time before the engine startup. He was in conversation with the first officer and with the captain. So this experienced person, being very quiet all through, we believe that if he saw any of the crew members doing something that he should not be doing, or not doing something that he should be doing, would have said something.
Retard power! Retard power!
The only word he said was, retard the throttles at the later stage of the event. Shows that that's the only thing he saw that should be done.
Even if the co-pilot had taken control sooner, there's no way to know if he could have saved the jet. Whatever took place on Flight 604 happened quickly. And since the plane had just taken off, the crew had little time to react before they crashed into the sea. The final report on the Flash Airlines crash was released in March 2006. There are no clear answers. Egyptian officials say that any of 4 mechanical problems could have caused the crash. They say disorientation may have played a role, but it's not the reason behind the accident. American investigators refuse to blame the plane. Instead, they say the problem lies with the airline, which didn't sufficiently train their crews.
The pilots are responding based on skills, abilities, knowledge, and what they got out of training. If the training was deficient, that's a company responsibility.
2 months after the crash, Flash Airlines went out of business. And as a result of the Flash 604 tragedy, new rules came into place to ensure that in the future, aircraft safety violations will be judged more harshly.
The Flash Airlines crash gave the final political impetus to a move to create a European blacklist where if one state banned an airline, then all the other European Union states would automatically ban that airline also.
The Egyptian investigation concluded with an important recommendation.
We have recommended that some kind of training or awareness program should be made to be able to have a pilot observe another being disoriented early and what he should do to first maintain a safe flight, second to pull the pilot from his disorientation back to orientation.
Was there a mechanical problem at the heart of the crash? Investigators will likely never know. With so much of the plane still at the bottom of the Red Sea, questions will always remain for investigators and everyone else who was affected by the crash.
I lost my nephews and my niece. They were just kids. What future would they have had? How can you put a price on that? What a waste.
The families will never be able to fully mourn, me included, because we'll never know what's really happened.